People ask me about the award. They want to know what it felt like to hear my name called, to walk up to that stage, to hold that statue in my hands. And I understand why they ask. It makes for a good story. But when I think about that night, that is not what I remember. What I remember is the weight in my pocket, a small gold watch that did not belong to me, a dead man's watch, and the terrible question of whether I had earned the right to carry it. Let me tell you something that may disappoint you. The best performance of my career had nothing to do with acting. It had everything to do with becoming someone I was not sure I deserved to become. When the script arrived at my home in the spring of 1961, I read it in a single evening. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling, not from excitement, from recognition, from a kind of fear I could not name. Here was a man I had spent my whole life pretending to be, a man of conviction, a man who did not bend, a man who stood in front of a mob and did not move. And I thought to myself, sitting alone in that room with the pages spread across my lap, I grew up in La Jolla, California, a beautiful place. The ocean in one direction, the hills in another, palm trees and salt air and the kind of sunlight that makes everything look clean. But beauty does not make a home. My parents separated when I was 5 years old. My father went one way. My mother went another. I went to live with my grandmother. She was a good woman. She took me to the pictures every Saturday and let me sit in the dark and watch men become heroes for 2 hours at a time. Cowboys and soldiers and lawyers who always said the right thing at the right moment. But when the lights came up, I always had to go back to a house that was not quite mine, a life that did not quite fit. I mention this not for sympathy. I mention it because it matters. When a child grows up without a father who stays, he spends the rest of his life wondering what that would have looked like. What it would have felt like to have a man who came home every evening and sat at the table and asked about your day. A man who taught you things. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. A man who showed you, by example, what it meant to be decent. Atticus Finch was that man, and I was terrified of him. The first time I met Harper Lee, I knew immediately that she saw through me. Writers are like that. They watch. They notice. They have a way of looking at you that makes you feel like your thoughts are printed on your forehead. She had this particular habit of tilting her head slightly when she listened, like she was measuring not just your words but the silence between them. We sat on the porch of her family home in Monroeville, Alabama, in the shade of an old oak tree, and she told me about her father, about the way he walked, the way he spoke to people, the way he never raised his voice, not because he could not, but because he did not need to. Power, she said, is not about volume. It is about conviction. She asked me why I wanted to play the part. I told her the truth. I told her I was not sure I was the right man for it. I told her there were younger actors, stronger actors, men with more fire in their eyes. I told her that Atticus required a kind of stillness I was not certain I possessed. I had spent 20 years in pictures. I had played soldiers and sea captains, and men who knew exactly what to do in a crisis. But this was different. This character did not fight with his fists. He fought with his presence, with his refusal to be moved. She looked at me for a long moment. The afternoon light caught the dust motes floating between us. Then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "The trouble with most men is they think courage is loud. My daddy knew better. Courage is what you do when nobody is watching. It is sitting up all night with a sick child. It is taking a case you know you will lose, because losing is not the same as being wrong. It is standing in front of your neighbors and telling them they are mistaken, even when you know they will hate you for it." I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the guest room of a small hotel and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the times in my life I had been loud when I should have been still. All the times I had performed courage instead of lived it. All the speeches I had made. All the righteous anger I had displayed. And I wondered how much of it had been real. There is a difference between performing virtue and possessing it. That difference is everything. When we began filming, I made a decision that I have never spoken about publicly. I would not act this part. I would let it act on me. Every morning, I would put on that three-piece suit and those round spectacles, and I would try to forget that cameras existed. I would try to forget that I was Gregory Peck, whoever that was. I would try to remember only that somewhere in this small southern town, a man was depending on me to tell the truth. A man who could not speak for himself because he had never existed except in the imagination of a woman who loved her father. The responsibility was almost unbearable. I felt it every time I stepped onto the set. The courtroom scene took 3 days to shoot. 3 days of standing in front of a jury that was not real, defending a man who was not real, in a case that was invented by a woman who had watched her own father do the same thing decades earlier, and yet nothing in my life has ever felt more true. I remember the moment I turned to face the camera and delivered the closing argument. I remember the heat of the lights, how the sweat would pool beneath my collar and I would have to stand perfectly still so it would not show. I remember the stillness of the crew, the faces of the extras in the gallery, some of whom had never been inside a movie studio before. They had been hired from the local community. Black men and women sitting in the balcony, watching a white actor pretend to defend a black man against a crime he did not commit. I wondered what they were thinking. I wondered if they believed me. I wondered if I believed myself. When the director called cut, nobody moved. Not for a long time. I stood there with my hands on the railing and I felt something I cannot quite describe. It was not satisfaction. It was not pride. It was something closer to grief. Because I knew, in that moment, that this story was not just a story. It was happening. It was still happening. In courtrooms across this country, men were being judged not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin. And there was nothing I could do about it except stand here, in this fake courtroom, and say the words that someone should have said a long time ago. That is when I understood what Harper Lee meant. This was not acting. This was testimony. One of the actors, a man named Brock Peters who played Tom Robinson, came to me after we finished shooting that scene. He had tears on his face. Real tears. Not the kind you summon for the camera. He said he had spent his whole life waiting for someone to tell this story. He said that growing up, he had never seen a picture where a white man stood up for a black man and meant it. He said he did not know if it would change anything in the world, but it had changed something in him. I did not know what to say. So I just put my hand on his shoulder and we stood there together in that empty courtroom set while the crew packed up the lights around us. That moment haunts me still. Not because it was sad, because it reminded me how small a thing I was doing compared to what needed to be done. Halfway through production, something happened that changed everything. Harper's father died. He passed quietly. In his sleep, in the same town where he had spent his whole life defending people who could not defend themselves. Harper did not say much about it. She was not the kind of woman who made her grief public. But I saw it in her eyes. I saw it in the way she moved around the set, like someone carrying a weight she could not put down. A few weeks later, she came to me with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was her father's pocket watch. Gold, worn smooth from years of handling. The chain still showed the marks where he had gripped it while waiting for verdicts. She told me he had carried it every day of his professional life. She told me she wanted me to have it. I tried to refuse. I told her it was too much. I told her it belonged to her family, not to me. I told her I was just an actor, just a man pretending to be someone I was not. She shook her head. Her eyes were steady. She said, "You are his family now. Whether you want to be or not, you carry his voice. You carry his way of standing. When people see you in this picture, they will see him. That is a burden and a gift. I am giving you both." I carried that watch in my pocket for the rest of the production. I carried it to the premiere, where I sat in the dark and watched myself on screen and wondered if I had done the man justice. I carried it to the ceremony where they gave me the award, not because it brought me luck, because it reminded me that I was not playing a character. I was honoring a man, a real man who had lived and died in a small Alabama town and who had never sought recognition for doing what was right. That is the burden of certain roles. They do not let you go. They follow you home. They sit at your table. They ask you questions you cannot answer. They make you examine every choice you have ever made. After the picture was released, people began to treat me differently. Not as an actor, as Atticus. They would stop me on the street and tell me stories about their own fathers, about men who had stood up when it was easier to sit down, about lawyers who had taken cases for free because the law is supposed to be for everyone, about teachers who had stayed late to help students who were struggling, about doctors who had treated patients who could not pay. Ordinary people doing ordinary things that turned out to be extraordinary. And I would stand there and listen and nod and feel like a fraud. Because here is the truth that nobody tells you about playing a hero. You do not become one. You just borrow the costume for a while, and then you have to give it back and figure out what kind of man you really are. I spent years asking myself that question. What kind of man am I? Am I the man who would stand in front of a mob? Am I the man who would take the case nobody else would take? Am I the man who would sit up all night with a sick child, not because I had to, but because I wanted to? Am I the man who would look his neighbors in the eye and tell them they were wrong, knowing they would never forgive him? I do not know. I honestly do not know. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of answer. What I do know is this. Playing Atticus did not make me a better man, but it made me want to be one. It made me pay attention to the small moments, the way I spoke to my children when I was tired, the way I treated people who could not do anything for me, the way I moved through the world when nobody was watching, the 1,000 small decisions that add up to a life. That is what Harper's father understood. That is what his daughter tried to teach me. Character is not something you perform for an audience. It is something you practice in private, every day, in every small decision, until it becomes so much a part of you that you do not have to think about it anymore. I have made many pictures in my life. Some were good, some were not. I have won awards and lost them. I have been praised and criticized in equal measure. I have had my name in lights and my face on posters that covered entire buildings. None of it matters. What matters is this. There was a man in Alabama who spent his life defending people who had nobody else to speak for them. He did it without fanfare. He did it without recognition. He did it because he believed that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. And his daughter loved him enough to write it down so the rest of us would remember. I did not know that man. I will never know him. But for a few months in 1962, I got to stand in his shoes. I got to speak his words. I got to show the world what quiet courage looks like when it refuses to turn away. That is not the peak of my career. That is the peak of my character, because it asked me to be better than I was. And I am still trying to live up to it. Every day, I am still trying. Some nights, late, when the house is quiet and I cannot sleep, I think about that old watch. I hold the memory of it in my mind. I imagine I can still hear it tick. And I think about all the times it sat in Amasa Lee's pocket. All the courtrooms. All the late nights preparing briefs by lamplight. All the cases won and lost. All the moments when he could have looked away and chose not to. The watch was stolen from me years ago. At an airport. Of all places. I do not know who took it or why. Just another piece of luggage lost in the shuffle. When I told Harper, she said it was only a watch. She was right. Of course. She was always right about the things that mattered. The watch was not the point. The watch was just a reminder. What it reminded me of, I carry with me still. Not in my pocket. Somewhere deeper. A man I never met. A role I never deserved. A responsibility I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor. That is the only story worth telling. The only one that matters.